Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 8, right around the halfway point. I feel like I'm still waiting for class to begin in some ways since I haven't seen anybody. But I do spend a lot more time on UNM Learn than I normally do, so I guess we're officially started. Anyway, we've been on a fairly strict chronological timeline in the course so far, kind of moving from one historical period to another very quickly, obviously. Right around this week is when we start to go a little bit more thematically. Obesity, chronic illness, food additives, preservatives, GMOs, various topics. You can see them on the syllabus. We kind of start to look at them sort of thematically, and they think about them in terms of the history of diet and health that we've been looking at. This week has a bit of both of the sort of periodization that we've been using and sort of a more thematic approach. Just 2 readings this week. And 2 new kinds of posts instead of the regular daily reading reflections. You're going to do bullet points. 5. There's 2 groups. This is all in the syllabus, but just to give you a quick overview, 5 bullet points of the most important things. If that's the group you're in, or the other group will do 5 bullet points of ways in which the reading connects to, disagrees with, or agrees with previous readings we've had. So pretty straightforward. I do want to emphasize that bullet points are not meant to be some cryptic sentence fragment that makes no sense. It's meant to be a complete idea. It might even be a couple sentences. So when I say bullet point, don't think, just a few words. Think complete idea, but you're not writing prose, you're not writing paragraphs. It's just the 5 distinct main ideas that you think are most important. You could give a brief example, you can give page references if you want, but it's really meant to just get you to think about what are the key ideas to take away, or what are the key connections or disagreements with other readings we've had. The other change for this week, there's no weekly reading reflection. We're taking a much needed break from those as we are next week. We have the whole week off, if you haven't seen that on the syllabus. Friday, we're going to have a reading quiz as a way of summing up a few big picture ideas about the 2 readings this week. So similar to the quiz we did last week, but it's really going to be focused on these 2 readings, including this video where I try to highlight some of the things for you to keep in mind as you're going through the reading. The quiz questions will be very closely tied to the posts that you do in the discussion board, on the bullet points and the connections. I'll be commenting on those as I normally do. And the quiz questions really come from this video, come from the readings. But it's really just this week, so you don't have to worry about previous stuff. For Monday, the chapter we're reading, Modern Food, Moral Food, goes from about 1900 to 1940, and it's not so much about a particular relationship between diet and health as we've been looking at. It's really about the development of the modern ideal of thinness. And so it's very much sort of an aesthetic analysis of, what kind of bodies do people want or think people should have in the early 1900s. And so the really good follow-up to Lulu Peters and her context. I wanted you to read that source first, and then we come back to a little bit more of the context to understand where that comes from. Because you see it now, you've seen Lulu Peters in conjunction with the other things from last week. Before vitamins, that is. So it's important as you're reading the chapter for Monday to keep in mind that consumer aesthetics towards interest in thinness and thin bodies is happening at the same time as vitamin research that we read about last week. They seem like totally disconnected things, just completely different, and they are. But they do together yield this very new approach to thinking about bodies and diets and health that we are still living in the wake of. A couple of highlights from the readings that I just want you to keep an eye out for and read a little bit more carefully when you see these themes. There's a lot of examples, there's a lot of detail that you can kind of skim over in these readings. We get a brief description in Monday's chapter about the changing attitudes towards fat. It used to be seen, excessive corpulence, bigger bodies were seen as a sign of prosperity. You could afford to eat, you were successful, you weren't starving, you were healthier. You were more robust. That view starts to change for various reasons. It's one reason so many immigrants wanted to come to the U.S. There was just an abundance of food. At least that was the rumor. Travelers from Europe would go and be amazed at how much people ate all the time. That was a main driver of immigration, is this kind of abundance. The author also talks about this sort of changing worldview in terms of thinking about calories and energy. And to borrow a nice example from the book, we might say now, a nutritionist might say now that someone would have to walk an extra mile to burn off the energy you get from 3 teaspoons of sugar, which is crazy that 3 teaspoons is actually a mile of walking. Walking is pretty efficient, actually. It doesn't burn a lot of energy. That's how we would say it. Like, you would have to walk an extra mile now because you had those 3 teaspoons of sugar. In the early 20th century, Americans more often would think of those 3 teaspoons of sugar as enabling them to do another mile of walking. There's a very different way. We're so, acculturated to thinking in terms of, if I eat this, how do I get rid of it? How do I prevent extra calories? Well, if you live in a world of scarcity instead of abundance, you think about what you can do, the energy you will have, rather than the energy you have to put into exercise to get rid of the calories. So a very significant change in the cultural mindset from one of scarcity to abundance, and that's happening because of same processes we've been talking about: urbanization and modernization, industrialization. People are buying more food. Calories are just more easily available, and it's a danger, right? From Lulu Peter's point of view, you're supposed to be thin, right? Not just women, men too. Lots of discussion of something we've already seen in Peter's. Being thin was a patriotic contribution to the wartime effort. It's far better for an individual, a citizen, a patriot, to be a little bit hungry than to waste the tiniest bit of food that could have instead gone to soldiers who are off fighting. Exercise, 1870 to 1900, there's a much greater emphasis on exercise. Physical education starts to become part of schools, just a few at first, but by the end of the 1800s, around the turn of the century, there are hundreds and hundreds of schools and universities that are adopting PE curricula for people to follow. So this idea that you're supposed to be exercising, we've already seen this idea that you're supposed to be doing light exercise. Galen talks about this. Everybody talks about it. You're supposed to be doing light exercise. But this idea you're supposed to be doing more strenuous exercise to maintain your health is definitely in response to this attitude about thinness and the questions about the relationship between fat and health. To be thin in the early 20th century, to be thin was to be modern. And that was very important, right? So it's this new kind of cultural standing. And a variety of factors are contributing to the explosion of weight loss culture. Okay, the application of calories, we've seen this with Atwater, general quantification, which we've seen happening. Another thing in terms of this fashion and body and health and diet sort of link that we're making with this reading, people are buying clothes. They're buying mass-produced clothes that have a size. And there's just a set range of sizes and a set, if you've all gone clothes shopping and not found something that fit you, right? Even though they all had these very discrete numbers. People have now, they're quantifying their size, right? That just didn't happen before, right? You didn't go to a store and think, oh, this number is kind of big. That just never happened. And now it is. It is. Speaking of sizes, there is perhaps no better warning about the subjectivity of quantification than in clothing sizes, especially like pant sizes. Our pants have simple numbers to represent sizes. Waist, inseam, hips. There's a couple of different things you can measure. But how you measure the body, where exactly you measure, the technique of measuring, how companies translate that into fabric patterns, how the contours of a real body fit into this pre-cut fabric, how the material of the fabric, how stretchy it is, all of these things just completely change the fit of anything, right? So it's infinitely complicated. Yet it gets boiled down to very few numbers, right? The same thing happens with almost every bodily metric, right? Anything you can measure, just about anything you can measure. BMI, body mass index, blood oxygen, pulse. There's all kinds of things you can measure that can be measured in different ways. Machines need to be calibrated in certain ways. People need to understand what that number means, right? And so in terms of both fashion and medicine, we're seeing this normalization of the body, right? What should the body look like and what should the measurements be? what is an average body? And with fashion, changing fashions, which are fabrics are thinner, they emphasize movement, they're supposed to be sleek and slender. We're getting constant visual cues now in society that fat bodies are deviant and immoral bodies, right? So it's the same kind of stuff we saw in Graham from 1830. 100 years later, now it's the same kind of thing, right? It's a variation on a theme, that this idea of fatness and excessive food is a sign of undisciplined, immoral behavior. So that's fun. Okay, Wednesday. We're reading about some diet texts written by somebody, a nutritionist named Adele Davis, who lived 1904 to 74. And she wrote most of her books in the late 40s. I think 47 was the first one, through the 50s and into the mid 60s. The article is really talking about how the books were received in the 70s when they were reprinted or reissued in paperback. And there were over 10 million, I think, copies of her books in circulation. That's a tremendous number of diet books. One of the most popular diet authors in the 70s. But she's writing in the 40s and 50s and writing for people at that time, even if not as many people were reading it as they would later. So it fits in really well with the course, and it builds on the emphasis we've seen in terms of calories, counting calories, vitamins, getting enough vitamins, and so on. It also brings up a couple other issues that we'll be looking at later on in the course. So it's kind of a connective tissue, I guess, between some of the early 20th century stuff we've been doing and some of the more thematic topics that we'll get to in the next few weeks. It shows, this Wednesday reading, it also shows how a number of topics we've covered are still very important. Domestic economy. Davis wrote a book called Let's Have Healthy Children, which is 51, I think. And it really builds on the fears of inadequate motherhood that we saw a lot in the vitamin ads and even in the New England Kitchen to some extent. There's a lot of attention and analysis in this article about Davis's expertise. She has a master's of chemistry from somewhere in California in 1939. So she knows something about science, and as the reading points out, her frequent use of numbers, her attention to experimental designs of the method of creating knowledge, and the forcefulness of her prose made her persuasive to many readers. And so what we see here, and we saw it a little bit in Lulu Peters, but she has a very distinctive, kind of a deliberately abrasive style. Davis is not quite as harsh, but she has this sort of persona that embodies popular science, right? She's not as snarky as Peters, but very direct, very forceful, very scientific, much more so than Peters, and very motherly at the same time, not coincidentally. In this article, we also get a lot about food additives, which was starting to grow tremendously from the late 40s as a result of the war ending, World War II ending. A lot of the companies making chemicals meant to kill people now had to do something else with that knowledge and the machines and so on. So they started doing things to improve agricultural yields, which we'll get to later. So I won't go into that in detail. But that's the context for why there's so many more food additives in the 40s and 50s. And Adele Davis is writing directly on these and their potential dangers. This text sort of shows us that this transition from thinking about all these new discoveries, micronutrients, trace elements, vitamins, and so on in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then that very clearly shifts from that sort of discovery of these things that make food, magical, to things that make it potentially dangerous. Natural diet even creeps in. Adele Davis says that she stresses over and over in lots of her books, actually, that primitive people were healthier and happier than Americans because they ate less refined food. They ate more natural food, and harkens back very much to the natural diet text from the early 1800s we see. So we're starting to see a lot of these sort of dietary strands connect across different centuries and sort of reappear in different contexts. And I think that holistic view of the history of diet is really useful for getting perspective of our own kind of dietary moment. When you think about sort of hip things now, like keto diets, I think that's probably the most popular one at the moment. looking at elements that we've seen literally centuries ago, looking at new ways of presenting it, looking at ways of establishing expertise. There's a lot of similarities here. The article is a great model. The Wednesdays chapter is a great model for, or article rather, is a great model on how to read a primary source. All the things I asked you to do a couple weeks ago in terms of the 3 that we read, I wanted you to do it for yourself, and now you can see how someone else does it. And you can appreciate how hard it is to really understand audience, or to really sort of synthesize a group of texts written by someone. So keep your work in mind from a few weeks ago as you go through this. I think she does a nice job. Remember, there's 2 kinds of readers for this text as you're going. This is probably the most confusing thing, just because we're reading the text now because it was written in the 40s and 50s, Adele Davis's text. The article really is focused on the 70s, which is a different, obviously, culture. And so it's easy to sort of get lost for us. It seems like we're reading it out of order. But remember, the texts she's talking about were written at exactly the same period we've been studying in the course. It's weird how much you can read quotes from Adele Davis. There's a lot of quotations in the reading for Wednesdays. We're not reading Adele Davis's actual text. We're just reading this article about it. You almost feel like you've read Adele Davis yourself. It's amazing how many things Davis says about our food, the quality of the food, the amount of food we eat, our attitudes towards food. It's amazing how much she says in the 50s. You read it and you think it could have been published earlier this year. Neither reading this week is overly long. They're not overly short either. So one tip on reading, if I haven't mentioned this before, I want to make sure to mention it now. Identify the main point that the author is trying to make in your paragraphs. That's part of your assignment, by the way, for your reading assignments. Identify the main point. When you understand that she's just giving you more examples, more detail, just read faster, skim it. Just skim, go fast. You don't have to read every word. When you get to a new idea, when you get to a new paragraph, think, is this different? What's going on? You can read a lot more efficiently that way. And that's also going to help you sort of sort out the wheat from the chaff in these articles in terms of pulling out the main points. That's it. I'll be back later this week with a quick video that goes over some of the most missed quiz questions and give you an overview of what I was trying to do and things to keep in mind from that as we move forward. I think we're going to have more quizzes in the class and less of the writing assignments. I won't speak for you, but I think it would be nice if we had less stuff to write on a daily basis and a little bit more variety in the kinds of things we can do to, make sure we're hitting the main points and getting on the same page. So that's it. Talk to you soon.